Hello and welcome to yet another tutorial by Davies Media Design. My name is Michael Davies, and in today's tutorial I'll be covering layers and layer masks. I'll be using GIMP version 2.10.20 for this tutorial, which is the latest version of GIMP at the time of this tutorial. Before I get into that, don't forget to check out my website at daviesmediadesign.com. As always, I have tons of video tutorials on here, my GIMP book of layers, and free software help articles, so definitely check that out. You can enroll in my GIMP 2.10 masterclass from beginner to pro photo editing on Udemy. You can enroll in any of my Skillshare classes by visiting gimpschool.com, and that does include my GIMP 2.10 layers and layer modes class. And you can get more with a premium membership to Davies Media Design. I'll include all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. I will be using a free photo for this tutorial, which is on Pixabay. Click the free download button, and I went with the 5000 by 3333 download. Click the download button there. All right, so let's dive in here. Layers play a very important role in GIMP, whether you are editing photos or creating graphic design compositions. But layers, by their most basic definition, are transparencies stacked on top of one another. And there are multiple types of layers. You have your standard pixel layer, so that's just a layer that contains a color or a set of pixels. You also have layers that are fully transparent, so they basically don't contain anything, they're just fully see-through. We'll get into that a bit later. There's also text layers, so layers that only contain text. And you have image layers, which are going to be the same as a standard pixel or color layer. Of course, those colors and pixels, though, are arranged in an image. There are no limitations in theory as to how many layers you can have in a composition, so it's basically as many layers as your computer can handle. So here I am inside of GIMP, and for many of you opening up GIMP for the first time, this is exactly what you'll see. I did not apply any customizations to this yet. On the left side, we have our tools. This is our toolbox. Down here, we have our tool options and some other tabs. These tabs are all called dockable dialogues. On the right side, we have more dockable dialogues, and down here you'll see one with an icon that looks like 3 sheets of paper stacked on top of one another. This is going to be the layers panel, so this is where everything regarding layers for the most part is going to be located. As of right now, because we just opened GIMP and don't have a composition open, we don't have layers. So when we create a new composition, the size of our layers is going to depend on the size of the document we create or the size of the image we open. So let me demonstrate here. If I wanted to create a new composition, which would also be my first new layer, I would go to File, New, and you can see the shortcut key for that is Control-N. So let's say, for example, I went with a width of 1920 and a height of 1080, and the unit here is going to be pixels. This means my first layer that I create will be 1920 by 1080 in terms of its dimensions. And if I come down here and click Advanced Options, I'm not going to get into this stuff for now, but what I will get into is the fill with option. So right now, this is going to fill my first layer with the background color, which is over here. I also have a variety of other options. So I have my foreground color, which would be black in this case. I can go with straight up white if I don't have black or white as my foreground or background color. So that's just a quick way to fill this with white, which is a common layer color. Transparency, which would be totally see-through, which I'll get into, or you could fill it in with whatever your current pattern is set to. So I'll just go with background color for now, which is the same as white, and click OK. So here you'll see we now have our first layer, and let me come over here. I can actually click my mouse and drag this out so that we have a bit more room with these dialogues. And let me just keep dragging this out until the icons down here are all viewable, and we will get into those icons. But here's our first layer, and by default, it'll be called background because this is going to be our bottommost layer for now, which will create a background on our composition. One thing you should notice is that your composition is outlined by a yellow dotted line, so it's like a yellow and black dotted line. This always denotes the boundary of your active layer. So this is the active layer boundary. If you don't see it, you might have it turned off, which is fine. You can go to View, Show Layer Boundary, and that will turn that off. Or if I have it off already, I can go to View, Show Layer Boundary, and that will create an X there, and now we can see the layer boundary. On the other hand, if I opened up a new image into GIMP, the size of our canvas would take on the size of that image. So let me show you. If I go to File, Open, if I haven't opened an image before, or in my case, Open Recent, since I did recently open up the image I want to use, which is going to be this image here. So I'll click on that. So here you'll see we have created a new composition using this image. And instead of this being 1920 by 1080, which is the size of our other composition, you can see up top here the size of this composition is 5000 by 3333 pixels. So anytime you open up a new image into a new composition, the size of the layers for that composition will take on the size of the photo. So coming back here to our document, you'll see this one is 1920 by 1080. So now that we've covered those basics, let's get into another important concept with layers in GIMP, and that is going to be layer transparency. And to understand layer transparency, we have to understand the different color channels found in GIMP. So GIMP is going to allow you to edit in either red, green, or blue color channels. So those are the main 3 color channels found in every document you edit in GIMP. And you'll remember we were working on our layers panel here. There's also a channels dialog, so it's the tab next to the layers panel. And you'll see here we have our 3 channels, red, green, and blue. The reason I mention this is there is also a 4th channel known as the alpha channel. The alpha channel is going to represent transparency. So in this image, you're seeing that we do not have an alpha channel, and that means that this document does not have transparency. So if I come over here to my layers panel, and let me come over and switch my color so that black is now my background color. If I were to grab my eraser tool, and then erase on this, it's just going to basically paint black with the eraser tool. So it's not actually erasing anything, it's just painting black. It's painting whatever our background color is. I'll hit Control Z to undo that. If I came over here to my layer, I can actually add an alpha channel, which is the same thing as adding transparency to this by right-clicking. And you'll see an option here called Add Alpha Channel. If that's grayed out, it means your composition already has an alpha channel and therefore already has transparency. But I'll click on this to add the alpha channel, and you'll see the layer here will go from being bold to now no longer being bold, the layer name. So let me just show you. Control Z, the layer name is bold there. That means there is no alpha channel. Control Y to redo that. Now we do have an alpha channel, and that's no longer bold. And if I come over here to the channels tab, you'll see we now have red, green, blue, and alpha. So the alpha channel is our transparency. I'll come back to the layers panel. Now with my eraser tool, instead of painting black, when I erase this, you'll see we have a gray checkerboard background behind here. So this gray checkerboard background means that this layer now contains transparency, and there's no other layers below that are displaying other pixels. So in other words, we kind of reached the end of the line here, and below here, there's nothing. So I just want to pause for a moment here and mention a couple of important concepts with transparency. Number one, once we add transparency to a layer like we've done here, all future layers inside this composition will contain transparency, so we don't have to keep doing this for all future layers in our composition. Secondly, I want to further define transparency. So for those of you who are still confused as to what transparency is, whenever something is fully transparent, it is fully see-through. So our layer, wherever there is transparency, will be fully see-through in those areas. Partial transparency is going to be partially see-through, so some of the pixels will still basically cover up that transparency and obstruct whatever the layers are below. And there's also full opacity, as I mentioned earlier, and something that is fully opaque is not see-through at all. So fully opaque pixels are going to totally obstruct the layers below. As you can see here, the white pixels right in this area are going to be fully opaque. If I hold Control and zoom in, because I used a fuzzy brush with my eraser tool, you can partially see the checkerboard background here, but you could still also see the white pixels. So that's partial transparency. And then here where you can only see the checkerboard background, that is full transparency. So if I hold Control and use my mouse wheel, I can zoom out. If I wanted to adjust the opacity of the entire layer simultaneously, I can come over here and adjust the opacity slider. So this is going to adjust the opacity of all of my pixels simultaneously on the layer. You can see this is making those fully opaque pixels now partially transparent. It's not going to have an effect on the pixels that are already fully transparent because those can't be made any more transparent. But essentially what the opacity slider represents is a percentage of opaqueness. So right now this is around 59.1% opaque. If I go all the way up, that's 100% opaque. If I go all the way down, that's 100% transparent or 0% opaque. So that's just a quick way to add or remove opacity to the entire layer. If I were to add another layer to our composition and then put that layer below the background layer, you would be able to see the pixels in this little transparent patch here. So let me demonstrate. I'll come over here and click to create a new layer. And I'm going to fill this with our background color, which right now, because we switched it, is black. And let me rename this layer here. I'll rename it black layer. And I'll come over here and click OK. So now we have an all black layer. This is a fully opaque layer. There's no transparency on it right now. But if I go to my channels tab, you'll see this does have an alpha channel. So as I mentioned, all future layers will contain that alpha channel. But now I can actually click and drag this layer below the background layer. And you'll see that those transparent areas we created with the eraser tool on our original background layer are allowing us to see the now black layer below. So that's what transparency does, is it allows you to see through that part of the layer that is transparent to the layer below. If I were to come over here to the background layer and make that my active layer and start erasing on this again, you'll see now it's just going to reveal more and more of that black layer below. And on the other hand, if I clicked on this black layer and made that my active layer and then use the eraser tool on that, because the white layer is transparent on this area, and then the black layer is transparent where we are painting the eraser, that's going to reveal the transparent checkerboard background there. So that's saying that there are no more pixels below this black layer. So in other words, we've hit the end of the line and all there is transparency. So this ability for layers to contain transparency, multiple layers for that matter, and the ability to stack multiple layers one on top of the other is part of what makes GIMP so powerful. It allows you to do things like add effects to photos, blend multiple layers or photos together, make image adjustments, add or remove objects to layers or photos, and more. So these are just a few examples of what you can do with layers and layer transparency. But now let me come over here to this black layer we created, and I'm going to hit this X icon in the layers panel. That's going to delete the layer. And one last thing I want to point out with transparency is if I come over here to the channels tab, you'll see we have an alpha channel here. So right now this is where our transparency that we created with the eraser is currently painted. So if I were to hide this layer, you'll see that will cause that little transparent area to disappear, and I can unhide it now. But I'll come back over here to the layers panel. If I wanted to remove the transparency I created here, I could right click and go to remove alpha channel. So this no longer has an alpha channel. I can also come over here, grab my white color, click and drag it on top of my layer, and that will paint over that black area that had replaced the transparency. And now we're back to where we were before. Of course, I do still want this to have transparency, so I'll right click and go to add alpha channel, and now we have transparency on here again. So we've covered layer transparency. Now let's move on to another important concept for layers in GIMP, and that is going to be the layer stacking order. So the order of the layers does matter inside of GIMP. Right now we only have one layer, so that's the only layer in our stacking order. But once again, if I wanted to, I could come over here, create a new layer, and we will just keep this name black layer, fill it with the background color, which is black, and click OK. Now we have two layers in our composition, so the layer stacking order does matter now. The black layer is going to be the top layer in the stacking order, and the background layer or the white layer will be at the bottom. So whatever is at the top of the layer stacking order are going to be the pixels that are displayed if there's no transparency. So in this case, there is no transparency on our black layer, so all we could see right now is black pixels, even though there is a white layer below. Since I do still have my eraser tool selected here, if I were to erase part of this image, and actually right now this is not erasing because I need to go to my channels tab and make sure my alpha channel is an active channel here. So you'll be able to tell if it's active because it'll be highlighted in a slightly darker color there. So there you can see that. Let me come back to the layers. So now if I use my eraser on the black layer, that's going to reveal the lower layer in the stacking order. So now it's revealed that white layer below. And you can see over here in the layer thumbnail, there's a little transparent patch on this layer now. And if I wanted to increase the size of my thumbnails here, I can click on this little menu, go to preview size, and we can go with something larger like extra large so we can see the layers a bit better. So there you can see that little transparent patch. You can see the gray checkerboard background there on this layer. If I were to create a new layer in this layer stacking order, it would show up above whatever my active layer is. So in this case, the black layer is my active layer. Let me come over here, click to create a new layer, and I'm just gonna name this layer shape, and I'm gonna fill this with transparency. And by the way, if you guys want a more in-depth look at creating new layers, I have an entire tutorial dedicated to that subject, which I will link to this video, so definitely check that out. But this is just going to create a transparent layer, so I'll click OK. You'll remember at the beginning of this tutorial, I mentioned you can have transparent layers as one of your layer types. But now let's come over here and grab a selection tool, and I'm just going to quickly draw a circle. Let me drag this in. This is actually more of an oval shape. And let me come over, grab a different color. So let's go with the red color here for my foreground color. And I can just click and drag that inside the circle. And I'll hit Control-Shift-A to deselect that area. So now we have this new layer at the top of the stacking order. And what it's doing, because we have all this transparency and then we have these pixels inside the circle shape, the circle shape is obstructing the layers below, and then all the transparent areas aren't obstructing anything because there's no pixels to do any obstruction. But if I were to come over here and click and drag this layer below the black layer, now that's no longer obstructing any of the black layer because that's at the top of the stacking order. And then we have that transparent patch on the black layer, which is showing the circle shape layer here. And wherever that circle shape layer is not obstructing the white layer, that's displaying below that. So I can always click and drag layers to change the stacking order, or come down here and use these little icons. So I can move that shape layer to the very bottom of the stacking order, and now we can't see it because it's obstructed by the background layer, or I can move this back up. So as I mentioned, new layers created will go above the active layer in the stacking order. So if I come over here and click on the black layer to make that my active layer, and then I come over and grab the text tool from my toolbox, you'll remember text layers were another layer type I mentioned can be created inside of GIMP. So if I were to click on my composition here, let's turn on the caps lock key and type "this is a test." You'll see that that text layer is created above the black layer, since the black layer was our active layer at the time we created the text layer. So now the text layer is below the shape layer in the stacking order, but above the black layer. And because of its position in the stacking order, it's being obstructed by the shape. It's kind of hard to tell because the shape and the text are the same color. Let me hit Control-A to select the text and just click to change the color here to blue. So I could come over here and change the stacking order by clicking and dragging the text layer up top. Now it's no longer being obstructed by the shape. On the other hand, I could drag it below, for example, the black layer, and now it's basically obstructed by everything except the transparent portions here, or wherever the shape does not overlap. Finally, I can also create a new layer and therefore add it to this stacking order by dragging another composition into this composition. So for example, we opened up this image earlier on in the tutorial. I can come over here and click on this tab, drag it over to the tab we've been working on, and then come down here and release this onto our canvas. So that will create a new layer above my active layer. So my active layer was this text layer. The new layer that we dragged from another composition is called dropped buffer. And by the way, if you want to drag the entire composition, you drag the tab. If you just want to drag a single layer from the composition, you can come over here and drag the layer, and then come over here and release it on this canvas, which I'm not going to do right now, mostly because there's only one layer for this image composition. But I'll come back over here to the composition we were working on, and let me just adjust the stacking order. So I'll change the text layer up to the very top, and same with the image layer. I'll drag that to the very top of the stacking order. And you'll see the image is not fully being displayed inside the canvas, so I'll hold Control zoom out. As you can see, the yellow dotted line denoting the layer boundary is going way outside the canvas boundary. So that actually leads me to the next important concept, which is going to be layer sizes. Layers can sometimes be larger than the overall composition, like in this case. And when that happens, there are several things we can do. So we can either change the size of the overall composition or change the size of the layer that we're working on. I can also reposition a layer that is larger than the canvas. So for example, if I hit the M key on my keyboard, that'll grab my move tool, and I can move this layer around to reposition it. So this canvas now acts as a sort of frame. So let's say I want to reposition it about right there. If I wanted to see the rest of the layer that's going outside of the canvas boundary, I can come over here and go to View, Show All. And so now what you'll see is the entire layer, and that's going to be the yellow dotted line. And then you can also see the canvas boundary, which is the red dotted line here. And if I hold Control and zoom out, you can see that there's this checkerboard background, which represents transparency. And because we have this set to show all, it just kind of goes off into infinity. So hold Control and zoom back in. And then if I hit the M key on my keyboard again and drag this around, we can see how the layer is positioned relative to the actual canvas and relative to the entire layer. So this just allows us to see other elements inside of our layer and get those elements inside of the canvas boundary if we want to. I'll turn this off by going to View, Show All again. So as I mentioned, I can change the boundary size of the layer or of the canvas, and there are a variety of ways to do that. So for example, let me start by changing the size of my layer boundaries. If I wanted to match these boundaries to the size of my canvas, I can go to Layer, Layer to Image Size. And when I do that, that will shrink the size of my layer down to the size of the canvas. Now when I go to View, Show All, you'll see that all that excess pixels, all of the excess pixels from that original layer are now gone. So this is now the entire layer, and if I move it around, now it's going outside the canvas and you can't see any portions of the original there. I'll hit Control Z to back up. So that brings back all of the original pixels. And let me go to View, Show All, and that will turn that off. So something else I can do is make the size of the canvas the same size of our image layer, so that'll make our canvas much larger. Remember, our canvas right now is 1920 by 1080, but if I go to Image, Fit Canvas to Layers, that will enlarge the canvas size to the largest layer size. So now you'll see our canvas size is 5000 by 3333. And if I come over here and hide the dropped buffer layer, which is that image layer, now you'll see that all of those original layers we created look much smaller because our canvas is much larger. And if I click on, for example, the shape layer, you could see there's the original layer boundary size. And same with the black layer and the background layer. Those all have layer sizes of 1920 by 1080. So I'll come back up here and show the larger layer size. And let me just hit Control Z to back up. So now our canvas size is back to 1920 by 1080. We can also go to Layer, Layer Boundary Size if we want to manually set the size of the layer boundary. So for example, let me come over here and click this little chain link icon. That just maintains the original aspect ratio of the layer. And if I know that I want the width to be, for example, 2000, I can type that in, hit the Tab key. You'll see that will shrink the layer size down to this little box. And I can center up the original layer if I want to, or I can drag it into place. And once I'm ready, I'll come over here and click Resize, and now the layer boundary will be resized. And of course, I can move this to reposition it. And the last way to change the size of our canvas or the layer is to come over here and use the crop tool. And I'm not going to fully go through this tool because I will dedicate an entirely separate tutorial to this tool. But basically, if I choose Delete Crop Pixels and come over here and just draw my crop area, this will change the size of both my canvas and my layer. So now if I click on here, you'll see that both of those items now have shrunk down and the new dimensions are up here. So I'll hit Control Z to back up and Control Z again to bring back my original layer size. All right, so now that you know how layers and canvas sizes work, now let's move on to the actual layers panel. There are many features in this panel that I think are worth mentioning, so let's just cover all of them. So for starters, the layers panel itself, as I mentioned, is a dockable dialog, so I can click and drag this off of the little area that it's in right now and release, and that will create a little floating dialog, and we can move this to wherever we want. So I can move it up here, for example. I'm just gonna click and drag this back to the default position. But the very top portion of the layers panel, it says mode. And if I click on it, it's a drop down with 38 different layer modes. So these layer modes allow you to essentially blend the layer that you're on, the active layer, with the layer below. In some cases, it goes the other way. I'm not going to go through all the layer modes right now because I do have an entire tutorial dedicated to that subject. But let me just come up here and choose a layer mode real quick to show you one example. So for example, I'll go with overlay. And now you can see that this layer, the layer with the guy on the dirt bike, is blending with some of the layers below. So it's actually skipped over the text layer and it's just blending with the shape layer here. So that's why you could see the little guy in the dirt bike blended with this red circle shape. But I'm gonna come back up here and just scroll up to the top and change this back to normal. So there are 38 layer modes, and then below that we have the opacity slider, which we went over earlier in the tutorial. That allows me to change the opacity here of this layer. So I can have this be partially opaque, which is going to also be partially transparent. If I wanted to, I could middle click with my mouse wheel and manually type in a value here. So I can go with 50, for example, which is 50% opacity, 50% transparency. Or I can use these little arrows to just adjust this by 1. I can also use my scroll wheel and that will adjust it by 1 as well. So below the opacity slider, we have our lock icons. So we have 3 icons here. The first icon is going to lock the pixels on this layer. This icon, when active, essentially is going to lock that layer and therefore not allow you to use any of the paint tools on this layer, as well as most of the transform tools. So for example, let me click this lock icon and then come over and grab the paint tool. Now if I try to paint on this layer, you'll see there's a little X on my mouse pointer, as well as over here it says the active layer's pixels are locked, so I can't paint on that. Also, if I were to come over here and let's go with warp transform for this example, and I try to warp this, the same message will pop up. The one exception to this is the move tool, so if I grab the move tool, I can still move this layer around, and that's pretty much the only exception to that. So let me come over here, I can click on the icon and that will unlock the pixels. So the next icon here is to lock position and size. When I click on that icon, this will lock me from basically moving this or performing any transformations on this. So I can't scale this layer up or down. Let me hit Shift S, that'll grab my scale tool. Now if I try to scale this, this will be locked. However, I can still paint on this layer. So if I hit the P key to grab my paintbrush tool, I can still paint on the layer, and let me just turn the opacity all the way up. There you can see we painted red on here. Let me hit Control Z to undo that. So I'll come back over here and click on this to remove that. The final lock option is going to lock the alpha channel. Let me actually just hide this top layer and the text layer. Click on the shape layer, and now come over here and lock the alpha channel. So right now the alpha channel is all the transparent portions. This basically means if I come over here, let me reset my colors and then switch my foreground color to white. If I use my paint tool, I can paint on the shape because this is not an alpha channel, this is just opaque pixels. But if I try to paint outside the shape, you'll see it'll stop. So my alpha channel is locked right now, which means I am not allowed to paint on the alpha channel, but I can still paint on these pixels. Let me hit Control Z to undo that. This comes in handy whenever you want to quickly change the color of a shape on a transparent layer. So in this case, if I wanted to change the color of this red shape and not have it affect any of the outside pixels, because I have the alpha channel locked on this layer, I can come over, click and drag this foreground color and release, and now the color of my shape has been changed to white. So I'll hit Control Z to back up. Let me click this lock so that this alpha channel is no longer locked. So those are all of the lock features. The next feature I want to go over in the layers panel is the show hide icon. So I've already used this a couple of times. That's going to be this little eye icon on the far left. So whenever you can see the icon, that means the layer is visible. If I click that icon will now disappear, which means this layer is now hidden. And you can't paint on a hidden layer. So you'll see here with my paintbrush tool, when I'm trying to paint on this, it says the active layer is not visible. If I show this layer and then I shift click on that eye icon, it'll hide all of the other layers. And then if I shift click on this again, it'll show all those layers. So that applies to any of the layers here in the layers panel. If I shift click on the shape layer, that hides all the other layers. Shift click again, that shows all the other layers. That is something I commonly use. The next feature in the layers panel is the transform lock feature. So you can't see this icon by default, but it's just to the right of the show hide icon. And you'll see here it looks like a little link icon. This usually confuses new users because it looks like a lock feature, but it doesn't actually lock anything. Those are obviously going to be what the lock icons are that we just went over. But what the transform lock icon does is it locks multiple layers together so that whatever transformation you perform on one layer is going to be transformed on all the other layers that it's locked to, or that it's linked to, I should say. So for example, let's transform lock this first layer and then come over here and transform lock the shape layer. So these two layers are now locked together, which means if I hit Shift S on my keyboard to grab my scale tool, so now I'm scaling the dropped buffer layer. If I hold Control zoom out, you can see the transform handles. But now if I scale this down, so let's just scale it down like that. Right now it just looks like the layer we're on is scaling down. But actually if I come over here and hit scale, you'll see both this layer and the shape layer have scaled down equally. So that's what that transform lock icon does. It also applies to moving the layers. So if I wanted to move both these layers simultaneously, I'll hit the M key and then I'll just move this around and you'll see both of those layers will now move in unison. I can always add more layers to this lock feature. So now you'll see the text layer is also moving with this. And when I release, they all release together. So that's what that feature does. Just like the show hide icon, if I shift click on that, all of the layers will be locked. And if I shift click again, only the layer that I'm clicked on will be transform locked. So let me click on that one more time to hide that. So let's just realign this. If I hit Control Shift J, by the way, that will center up my canvas and fit it inside of the entire image window. The next feature, of course, is the layer thumbnail. So that's just displaying a preview of what is displayed in the layer. The text layer is going to have this little T icon. So let's come back up to the top layer. The next feature is the layer name. So we can change the name of any of the layers by double clicking on the layer name. And I'll just name this dirt bike, hit the enter key. So that's how you change layer names. So now let's move on to the bottom portion of our layers panel. So we've already gone over the first icon, which is to create a new layer. If you just want to create a new layer with the same characteristics as the last layer you created, just shift click on that. And the last layer we created was the shape layer, so that had a transparent background. And the name is shape, and because this is already a duplicate name, so we already have shape down here, it's just going to add number 1 to differentiate it. The next layer icon is to create a layer group. So when I click on this, it's going to create a little folder icon, and by default, it'll be named layer group. We can double click on this and rename it just like any other layer. So let's rename this image with shape, hit the enter key. And what I can do with layer groups is I can drag layers into them. So for example, I can drag my dirt bike layer into here, as well as my shape layer. And now both of these layers are inside the layer group. And you'll see there's a little icon here. This just allows us to collapse the layer group, which helps to clean up our little space down here. So I can always expand this or collapse it. I can also show or hide both layers simultaneously inside this layer group. Or if I expand this, I can show or hide just one of the layers in the layer group. So apart from keeping our composition organized, I can also simultaneously add layer modes to the layers inside the layer group. So for example, I could change this to overlay, and now both layers inside the layer group have the overlay feature on here. And because the layer below that this is interacting with is the black layer, the overlay effect isn't really doing anything. So let's come back up here and go to normal. You can also add layer masks to layer groups, which I'll get into momentarily. But the next icon is another icon we already went over, and that is going to be the ability to raise or lower layers in the layer stack. So for example, if I click on the shape layer and click on this icon, that'll move the shape layer. This is the shape duplicate layer to the very top of the stacking order. On the other hand, if I come over here and click the other icon, it'll move it down. If I shift click, it'll move that layer to the very bottom of the stacking order. Shift click on the other icon, it'll move it to the very top. The next icon is the duplicate icon. So for example, if I came over here to my black layer and I hit this icon, that will now create a duplicate of the black layer. So there you'll see it's named black layer copy, and I can move this up to the very top. So now we have two of these layers in two different positions in the stacking order. The duplicate icon is something I use pretty often, especially when I'm editing images, because I can duplicate the original image that I'm editing, and that just allows me to keep a copy of the original image or a copy of an image at a particular stage in my photo editing. So that just helps preserve the original image. The next icon is the merge down icon. So this just allows me to merge multiple layers together. So for example, if I wanted to merge this black layer with the shape layer, I'll hit the merge down icon, and now that black layer and shape layer become one. And it'll take on the name of the layer below. So if I wanted to rename this, I can double click on it and once again name this black layer copy. Hit the enter key. I can also merge a layer with a layer group, which I'm not going to do. Or I can merge, for example, a text layer with the layer below. So let's click on this text layer, click the merge down button, and now the text and this black layer have become a single layer. I'm going to skip over the layer mask icon here, which is the next icon, because I'm going to go over that in a bit more detail. But the final icon is the delete this layer icon. So let's come back up here to the black layer copy and delete it. And so all that icon does is delete whatever active layer we're on. I'm also going to come over here to the black layer and delete that layer for the next step. An important thing I want to mention before I move on to the last section of this tutorial, which is going to be layer masks, is that at the time of this tutorial, GIMP does not have the ability to select multiple layers simultaneously, although I have seen evidence that the GIMP team has been working on integrating this feature in a near future release version of GIMP. So I do believe that this will be a feature coming to GIMP very shortly. That being said, let's move on to the final portion of this tutorial, which is going to be the important topic of layer masks. Quick disclaimer, I'm not going to totally cover layer masks for this tutorial because I could spend hours on this topic. However, I do have my GIMP book of layers as well as my GIMP masterclass. I do cover the layer masks topic in depth in both of those resources, so check those out if you want to know everything about layers and layer masks. But what I'll do is come over here to the dirt bike layer. So this is inside of a layer group, but it's still its own layer. And I can add layer masks to either a single layer or to a layer group. So right now I'll just add this to the dirt bike layer, and I can add a layer mask by clicking the layer mask icon here, or I can come up top, right click, and go to add layer mask. So here is our Add Layer Mask dialog box. And for those of you who don't know what a layer mask is going to allow you to create areas of transparency on a specific area inside your image. So that's going to be different from the opacity slider, because the opacity slider is going to add or remove transparency to the entire layer or the entire image. This allows you to create concentrated areas of transparency. Some of you might be asking, how is that different from the eraser tool? It's essentially not different from the eraser tool, except for the fact that the eraser tool works directly on the layer, whereas the layer mask removes that and adds a separate area where you can work on the transparency. So in that respect, it is a non-destructive way to add transparency to your images. Also, you can use the layer mask to add things like gradient transparency. So you can use the gradient tool or any paint tools for that matter on a layer mask to create various transparency effects. I'll show you guys what I mean. But first we have to choose how we want to initialize the layer mask. So in this case, I'm going to go with white full opacity. I'm not going to explain all the various ways to add a layer mask because I do have an entire lecture on this, which is 17 minutes long. So it's quite a lengthy topic, but I'm just going to go with white full opacity for now. The reason white has full opacity next to it in parentheses is that white on a layer mask represents full opacity. Black on a layer mask represents full transparency. So let's go with the white full opacity option and click add. That will add a white layer mask to my dirt bike layer. Let me just click and drag this out so we can see the full picture here. So once we added this layer mask to our layer, nothing has happened yet, because as I mentioned, white is going to be full opacity, or in other words, it's going to fully display the layer below. But if we wanted to add transparency to this, we would want to paint black. So let me hit the P key on my keyboard, switch my foreground color to black, and now making sure we are on the layer mask as opposed to being on the layer. So you can click on either the layer mask or the layer. So make sure the layer mask is active. Now if I paint black on this layer mask, you'll see it's going to reveal the layers below. So in this case, we have the red shape layer below, or if we come over here, we have the white background layer below. So anytime we paint black on a layer mask, it's like using the eraser tool, except it's not happening directly with the pixels on our image layer. It's happening on the layer mask, so that's why it's non-destructive. You can see here in the thumbnail that the image is totally intact. On the other hand, if I switched my color here to white and I paint that color back in, you can see that's bringing back the opacity on this layer mask. And let me come over here, click on the dirt bike layer and bring the opacity up to 100, and then come back to the layer mask and paint on this. So white is going to bring the image back. hit the X key to switch back over to black, and that's creating transparency wherever we paint on the layer mask. So I'll hit Control Z to back up. So now we just have our white layer mask again. If I hit the G key on my keyboard, that's going to grab my gradient tool. Let me hold the Control key and zoom out using my mouse wheel. So now while we're on the layer mask, if I were to paint a gradient on this layer mask, and right now my gradient, if I click on it, it's set to foreground and background RGB, which is this option. So foreground is going to be black to background is going to be white. So this is a black to white gradient. Remember, black is going to paint transparency on a layer mask. White will paint opacity. So what this will do if I draw the gradient is it's going to create this gradient where on the left side in this case it's going to be fully opaque. So this is the white area, and then on the right side this is fully transparent. And then the areas in between are going to be a middle gray color. So anytime we paint middle gray or any shade of gray on a layer mask, that's going to paint partial transparency. And because this is a gradient, I can shift what's called the midpoint, and that's changing how this is fading. I have an entire tutorial dedicated to the gradient tool if you want to check that out. But if I hit the Enter key, that'll apply the gradient to the layer mask, so you can see what's going on over here with the gradient and the layer mask. And this is just one way to create some effects. As I mentioned, you can also add layer masks to layer groups, so not just a single layer. So in this case, because one of our layers has a layer mask in the group, this is a way to essentially add a second layer mask to a single image, but it's also going to add a layer mask to the shape layer as well. So let's come up top here to our layer group, and I'll come over here and click the layer mask icon. And let's once again go with white full opacity and click add. So now our layer group has a layer mask. And if I wanted to, for example, add another gradient to this layer mask, let me this time change the shape here to radial. We're still going from black to white here, or white to black. So if I draw this radial layer mask on the layer group, you'll see what happens there. So this area below is white, the area up top is black. Let me just come over here and switch the gradient colors. So that's just going to reverse that. And let's also just shift the gradient so I can live edit the gradient on the canvas here. So this is applying this layer mask to both the dirt bike layer and the shape layer below. So you can see the red shape layer is fading out here. And when I hit the Enter key, you can see that's what's happening over here on the layer mask. We've got black in the bottom left corner. It's fading to middle gray and then fading to white. And as I mentioned, these layers are non-destructive, so the layer masks themselves are separate from the images. So if I wanted to go in and delete any of these layer masks, I can right click, and you'll see there's a variety of layer mask options here in this little layers menu. But I can go over here to delete layer mask. If I wanted to apply the layer mask to the image, I can click apply layer mask. I can show just the layer mask here so we can see what's happening on the layer mask. And you'll see that whenever we have that option selected, it's going to outline the layer mask in green. So I'll go to show layer mask again to turn that option off. If I wanted to temporarily hide this one layer mask, I can right click and go to disable layer mask. So now the only layer mask that's showing is going to be the layer group layer mask. And this is outlined in red, which means it's temporarily turned off. So I'll right click, choose disable layer mask again. If I wanted to turn this layer mask into a selection, I can right click and go to mask to selection. So now you'll see that our layer mask is selected here. The reason this doesn't look right is just based on how selection areas work. So everything that is 50% opacity or more is going to be inside the selection area. Everything 50% opacity or less is outside the selection area. So this is selecting the entire gradient. It just doesn't look like it based on how selections work. I do have an entire tutorial dedicated to how selections work if you want to check that out. But the cool thing I can do with selections and layer masks is I can transfer this layer mask now basically to this other layer. So for example, the shape layer. If I right click on here and go to add layer mask and choose selection and click add, that essentially copies our layer mask to the shape layer, and now you can see this has a gradient going from black to white. And I'll hit Control-Shift-A to deselect that. I can always delete a layer mask by right-clicking and going to Delete Layer Mask, or if I wanted to basically merge the layer mask with the layer, I can right-click and go to Apply Layer Mask, And now you'll see the layer mask and the layer have been merged together. So this is no longer non-destructive. This is now happening directly on the layer. And I can hit Control Z if I want to undo that. And if I wanted to get rid of this, once again, I can right click and go to delete layer mask. And now we have our original image. Let's do the same for the layer group mask. So right click, delete layer mask, and now all of our layer masks are gone. So there is obviously a lot to the topic of layers as well as layer masks, but hopefully I was able to clarify some things for you guys in terms of both of those concepts. If you still have questions in regards to layers or layer masks, there are a few different resources I have available that dive deeper into these topics. For example, you could check out my GIMP masterclass, my GIMP book of layers, or become a GIMP premium member. Otherwise, that's it for this tutorial. Hopefully you liked it. If you did, you could check out my YouTube channel at youtube.com/daviesmediadesign. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified each time I have a brand new tutorial. You can also check out any of the links to my resources in the description of the video. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.